Welcome. My name is David Peck. I am the Treasurer of Quarter Coronati Lodge number 2076. As you may be aware, I was due to deliver this paper in Quarter Coronati Lodge at Freemasons Hall, London on Thursday, 23rd of June 2022. However, owing to the planned rail strike on that day, we've had to postpone that meeting. So I'm recording a delivery of my paper at my home in Buckinghamshire. I am going to tell you about the life and times of a staunch Roman Catholic who was one of the earliest Provincial Grand Masters of the 18th century, who was appointed to the rank of Provincial Grand Master for Buckinghamshire at the time when there were no active lodges in Buckinghamshire. As you will see, my presentation is in 4 parts. Firstly, I deal with St. John's non-Masonic life and times. The second focuses on Catholics' freedom to become Freemasons at that time. The third briefly looks at the process, if you can call it, of becoming a Provincial Grand Master in the 18th century. Finally, I compare Sir John Throckmorton's life with that of some of our current rulers. But before I commence, I need to point out that throughout this presentation, I call my subject Sir John, but as you will hear, a title he did not actually inherit until the age of 38. So let me start by introducing the leading character in this story. Sir John Courtenay Throckmorton was born in 1753 into one of the prominent, wealthy and staunchly Catholic families in England. Previous generations of the family were involved in notorious Catholic plots against the king and government, including the Gunpowder Plot. His early years were spent growing up at Coton Court in Warwickshire, and in later life at Weston Underwood in Buckinghamshire and Buckland House in Berkshire, 3 quite impressive estates. He was the second son of George Throckmorton, note, not Sir George. Sir John had 9 other siblings. You will hear briefly about a couple of his brothers later. He succeeded as the 5th Baronet in 1791. On the death of his grandfather. His education was typical of the time for his social class, with a significant Catholic twist. Up to the age of 12, Sir John was privately educated at home by the family Catholic chaplain. Subsequently, he was then sent to the English Benedictine Priory of St. Gregory in Douai in France. After Douai, he continued his education by going on a 2-year European Grand Tour with his younger brother George. Under the tutelage of a monk, Augustine Walker, whilst in Rome, he declined an offer to meet the Pope, which in later life he regretted. You will hear, as there was no legal Roman Catholic institution in England at the time, the collective term for the remaining Catholics was Catholic Congregation, not Catholic Church. Henry VIII's Reform Parliament, which broke with the Pope and the Church of Rome and established the Church of England with Henry as its head, resulted in all former Roman Catholic dioceses in England and Wales becoming Anglican. Hence, for nearly 300 years, there was no formal Catholic hierarchy in England. The Vatican regarded England as missionary territory. Please remember this, as this has major significance later. As there were no longer any Roman Catholic dioceses or parishes, the congregation operated a network of covert missions, often based in country houses of Catholic families. The Roman Catholic congregation in England was overseen by 4 missionary bishops, known as Vicars Apostolic. Each Vicar Apostolic was responsible for a missionary region. Each Vicar Apostolic was a titular bishop. In Sir John's time, the Roman Catholics lived with many legal restrictions. They could not legally worship, live in London, vote, study at Oxford and Cambridge, become an MP, hold public office, or serve in the army. They could not own or operate religious schools or colleges, hence Sir John's education at home and in France, and until 1791, if they failed to regularly attend an Anglican church, they committed a statutory offence and were subject to a heavy fine. The Act of 1778 still did not grant freedom of worship, but did allow Catholics to join the army and purchase land. However, the Protestants still stirred up considerable anti-Catholic sentiment, culminating in the Gordon riots in June of 1780 in London, with looting and burning of Catholic chapels in foreign embassies, resulting in nearly 500 casualties, which was only suppressed when the army was sent in by the government. 1782 was a pivotal and busy year for St John. In June he was elected as a member of the revived Catholic Committee. The committee sought to further the achievements of the 1778 Catholic Relief Act through emphasising the independence of English Catholics from papal control. More about that follows. 3 days later he was initiated into Freemasonry in the Royal Lodge. More about that lodge and the whys and how later. 2 months later he married Maria Catherine, who outlived him. They had no children, hence on his death the baronetcy passed to his younger brother George. Sir John worked as an active member of the revived Catholic Committee to demand that instead of Vicars Apostolic being appointed by the Pope, the laity and clergy should elect their own bishops. To promote this concept, in 1790 he wrote and published 2 lengthy documents. You can read their full titles on the slide. The first anonymously with 22 pages, which ended, "I am, gentlemen, your obedient, humble servant, a layman." You may see some humour in his use of the pen name a layman. The second, under his own name, which answered the questions raised by the first, was 113 pages long, with almost as many pages as an appendix. These 2 books helped bring about the 1791 Catholic Relief Act, with which Catholic worship became legal. Also, Catholics could own their own schools, to hold junior public office, and interestingly, to live in London. You have already heard of the 3 family estates outside London, but there is no record of the family owning a large London residence. In 1791 he was installed as the master of the Royal Lodge, but more about the Royal Lodge later. In the same year he inherited the baronetcy. Now actually, as Sir John, he embarked on his second European tour, this time accompanied by his wife. Sir John and his wife were very fortunate to leave Paris only 2 days before the insurrection, when armed revolutionaries stormed the Tuileries Palace. With several difficulties he escaped to Switzerland and continued the grand tour, returning to England in 1793. Immediately he threw himself once again back into opposition politics. Sir John took up chairmanship of the Whig Foxite group, Charles Fox being the Whig leader in the Commons, hence the name Foxite, a political organisation started in 1792 by some of the members of the Whig Party that focused on advocating wide-ranging parliamentary reform. They introduced a petition in the House of Commons highlighting the level of influence by the gentry in elections, the small number of voters in some constituencies, and the lack of representation for industrial towns. The motion was lost. In 1796 he was awarded the honorary degree of Doctorate of Civil Law by Oxford University. His address was recorded as one of his country estates at Buckland in Berkshire, quite close to Oxford. The university archives do not record the reasons for the honour, but one might speculate it was owing to his work in support of Catholic Emancipation. In 1806 he also published a book entitled Considerations Arising from the Debates in Parliament on the Petitions of the Irish Catholics. His prominent support of Catholic emancipation only bore most of its fruit well after his death in 1819, and resulted in the new Emancipation Act of 1829, which removed many more restrictions on Catholics. The Act admitted Irish and English Roman Catholics to Parliament as MPs, including a few years later one of Sir John's brother's sons. By now Catholics were allowed to take up all but a handful of public offices. Setting the scene for Pope Pius IX to re-establish the English Catholic Church diocese hierarchy in 1850. Catholic emancipation in the United Kingdom was now virtually complete. However, this effectively ended an era of Catholics having unopposed membership of English Freemasonry. Notwithstanding all the civil restrictions on Catholics in St. John's time, there were no limitations on Catholics becoming Freemasons by either of the Grand Lodges nor by the Roman Catholic Church in England. Note here I use church, not congregation. You will see why in the next slide. You will remember, for almost 300 years, from the time of Henry VIII, the Vatican had regarded England as missionary territory. Hence there was no formal Roman Catholic hierarchy in England in St. John's time. Hence there was no legal Roman Catholic authority in England. Therefore the Church of Rome were unable to enforce papal bulls in England, including the original so-called ban on Catholics becoming Freemasons in the famous papal bull of 1738. Therefore, without falling foul of the rest of the Catholic congregation, many Catholics became active Freemasons, some achieving the highest offices in both Grand Lodges. Before Sir John was initiated, there had been 4 Grand Masters who were Roman Catholics. I will leave you to read the list, but I will point out the last one. You will hear more about the influence he may have had on Sir John's Masonic career. These Freemasons were often highly influential in the leadership roles in the Roman Catholic laity. The records of the Royal Lodge list the name John Throckmorton at least 7 times, and John Throckmorton spelt slightly differently at least once. The main reference is as follows: Throckmorton John, Esquire, of Harley Street, proposed by Brother Meade, passed the Lodge of an apprentice, and was by permission of the Lodge advanced the degree of a fellowcraft, 6th of June 1782. His proposer Meade, who seemed to have had somewhat of a checkered Masonic career, is recorded as follows: Meade Dominic, elected Treasurer December the 6th, 1781, and so continued until December 4, 1783, when he was not re-elected because of gone abroad to the West Indies. His next attendance was twice in February 1787, again elected as Treasurer in February 1788, but declined re-election on account of absence. He was Master in 1799. Meade is not recorded as being initiated into Royal Lodge. However, the remaining Royal Lodge records do not start until after the likely date of his initiation. Elsewhere, a Dominic Meade is recorded as a Grand Steward in 1771 as a member of Royal Lodge. Meade is still somewhat a mystery to me, as is his exact relationship with Sir John. So far, the only additional information I've been able to identify on him are some details of his activities in the West Indies. He died in 1805. It was expensive to be a member of Royal Lodge, which may have made it somewhat exclusive. The annual subscription was 4 guineas, £700 today, with a similar fee on becoming a warden or master. By the time Sir John was initiated, it is clear he moved in senior social and Catholic circles involving many prominent Freemasons, with membership of or visitors to the Royal Lodge. It is most likely that one of his acquaintances, perhaps even Lord Peter, a previous Grand Master, had asked Meade to act as Sir John's proposer. Lord Peter and Sir John had close connections in the Catholic committees. In the same year that Sir John was initiated, along with Lord Peter, Sir John was one of the founding members of the Cisalpine Club, whose aim was to perpetuate their radical Anglo Gallicanism principles, which was seen by some as disloyal to the Holy See. Membership lists of the Cisalpine Club reveal at least 12 members were Freemasons. Lord Peter would have known Dominic Mead. Mead was a Grand Steward in 1771, the year immediately before Lord Peter became Grand Master. Hence Mead would most likely have been heavily involved in the preparation for the Grand Lodge meeting and feast of May 1772. Let me give you a very brief resume of Sir John's Masonic career. At the age of 28, he was initiated and passed in June 1782 in the Royal Lodge number 251, meeting at the Thatched House Tavern, St James's Street, London, where another 9 lodges met. He was not raised until April 1787. He was the Master of Royal Lodge in 1791 and 1798. Only 9 years after he was raised, he was appointed, or more correctly given the grand rank of Provincial Grand Master for Buckinghamshire on the 13th of April 1796, the first time that title had been used. More about the province, or not, of Buckinghamshire will follow. In 1817 he joined the Foundation Lodge in Abingdon, Berkshire. He may have joined this lodge owing to one of his family homes, Buckland House, Farringdon, which was about 11 miles away. In the same year, somewhat late in life, he was exalted into the prestigious Royal Arch Chapter of St James's No. 2. Sir John was an active member of Royal Lodge, which is, as you will hear, very different to some of the other members. So let me briefly summarise his involvements. As I've already said, he was master twice. In 1792 he objected to the proposed stylish uniform for members. At the time it seems that several prestigious London lodges were discussing distinct uniforms. However, the typical dress of the time looked stylish enough for me without any more brass buttons. He proposed 4 candidates for membership. Whilst master, he did not propose his brother William. Perhaps he saw it as a conflict of interest. However, in 1791 William was proposed and seconded by members, both of whom were originally proposed by St John. Nor did he propose his brother Charles, who in 1785 was the founding treasurer of the Lodge of Roman Eagle in Edinburgh. Charles is the subject of my next paper, which includes details of his imprisonment, if that's what you call it, and Masonic activities in France during the Napoleonic Wars. Let me briefly address what I have called at this time the phantom province of Buckinghamshire and its relationships to the province of Berkshire. When Sir John was given the rank of PGM, there were no active lodges in Buckinghamshire. The only lodge formed in Buckinghamshire before his death in 1819 was the Etonian Lodge in 1813, but in 1825 it defected to Windsor in the province of Berkshire, where there were other active lodges. In 1817 Sir John was also appointed the Provincial Grand Master of Berkshire. The 2 provinces continued to operate separately. The slide shows their subsequent, somewhat checkered history. It was only in 1891 Buckinghamshire had, for the first time, its own true Provincial Grand Master in Lord Carrington. Before Sir John was appointed to the rank of Provincial Grand Master for Buckinghamshire, there are no records of him attending Grand Lodge meetings. After his appointment in April 1796, he attended the next Grand Feast in May, presumably as a Provincial Grand Master for Buckinghamshire. His diary records only dined at Grand Festival, Prince of Wales in chair. There is no record that he was formally invested in any sort of ceremony. Subsequently, he attended only annually for the next 3 years. It then appears that he did not attend for the next 13 years, then twice in 1813, where he is recorded as President of the Grand Lodge Board of Schools, an appointment which he held until 1817. He was then simply a board member until the end of his life. Brother Berman has written what may in reality be typical of the time. The appointment of a provincial or district Grand Master was historically in the gift of the Grand Master, and in many cases appears to serve an ornamental rather more than active office. Whilst today this may seem strange, in the late 1700s and early 1800s this did not appear to be uncommon. A similar case is the appointment of a fellow Catholic pupil of St Gregory's School at Douai, Grand Tour Traveller and member of Royal Lodge. Sir John Swinburne, who in 1806 was offered the post of Provincial Grand Master of Northumberland. In his acceptance reply he includes the words, "20 years ago I was made a Master Mason, and I am ashamed to say various circumstances have prevented me from attending any lodge since." Several members of Royal Lodge served as Grand Stewards for 1 year, including Meade. Several attained senior grand ranks at home and abroad. See the list on the slide, which includes one of Sir John's predecessors in Berkshire, Arthur Stanhope. Quite a number of visitors were Grand Stewards, including Sir Thomas Tancred, Prince Grand Master of Yorkshire, from 1771. As an aside, one of the Yorkshire Provincial websites in its history on Yorkshire Freemasonry reports, it was probably not until 1769, with the appointment of a true Yorkshireman, James Heseltine, as Grand Secretary in London, that the Premier Grand Lodge of England became acquainted with the geography of the county. It was no doubt upon his advice that Sir Thomas Tancred was appointed Provincial Grand Master for the whole of Yorkshire. To very briefly complete the story on Royal Lodge, in 1824 it merged with Alpha Lodge, which itself was only formed in 1823 by the merger of a number of other lodges, and together they became the then and now prestigious Royal Alpha Lodge No. 16, which is effectively the Grand Master's personal lodge. Another aspect of Sir John's life can be seen from an event in 1811. A few days after the Duke of Wellington's victory at the Battle of Waterloo, Sir John, based on his beliefs in the enhancements made in cloth manufacturing methods by that time, made a quite unbelievably large wager of 1,000 guineas that, at 8 p.m. on the 25th of June, he would sit down to dinner in a coat of wool, made from the fleeces of 2 sheep, shorn at 5 a.m. the same day. He won the wager. 1,000 guineas is worth about £170,000 today. Sir John died in 1819 at his home at Weston Underwood, Buckinghamshire. He was laid to rest in St Peter's Church of England churchyard in Coton, Warwickshire, not the later Catholic church built by the Throckmorton family in the grounds of their family estate at Coton Court. There is no reference either to his death or to any Throckmorton as a Grand Officer or attending Grand Lodge in the quarterly communications of Grand Lodge for the whole of the period until December 1979. Whilst the life and Masonic career of a wealthy Catholic member of the 18th century landed gentry may at first appear radically different to that of our current rulers, but is it really? Let me start my comparison by briefly summarising Sir John's life. He was born into a wealthy, titled Catholic family. He had a good Catholic education, a Masonic career closely linked to his Catholic, social and school acquaintances, many of whom had a shared dedication to achieving equal rights for Roman Catholics. In his time there were no restrictions on Catholics becoming Freemasons. He was a lifelong campaigner for full Catholic emancipation. Well, I doubt that many of our rulers were educated at home, and definitely not by a monk. But many are from the wealthy middle or upper social classes, or with a father serving as a senior officer in the military or a senior grade civil servant. When very young, they may have had a nanny or au pair to look after them, receiving an excellent start to their education by attending a good kindergarten or nursery school, where they were taught by professionals. They may well have gone to a good prep school, then a good public or grammar school, followed by a good university, if not Oxford or Cambridge, on the way making many social and Masonic contacts, completing their educational experience with a pre- or post-gap year, travelling the world. So perhaps not so different. But other circumstances certainly have changed, and some not for the good. Today the opportunity for professional, social and Masonic preferment is somewhat more evenly spread, and not just restricted to mainly the wealthy, nobility and landed gentry. However, Catholics in the 18th century could openly be members of the fraternity. Now there are specific problems for Catholics and others in being too open about their membership of the fraternity. Post-World War II, the press have spread many untrue and negative stories, which are still deterring some good potential candidates from joining us. Freemasons have had to resign or become inactive after marrying into certain religious families. Recent changes in the attitude of some organisations have caused resignations from Freemasonry. Finally, perhaps the less said about Sir John's contribution to Freemasonry in general in Buckinghamshire and Berkshire, the better. His Grand Lodge titles most likely reflect his wealth, gentry status and connections in society, rather than his dedication to Freemasonry and his active roles as a provincial Grand Master of 2 provinces. But, however, using a modern phrase, this fascinating 18th century Mason made a very major contribution to Freemasonry in the community, in terms of his dedication to progressing Catholic emancipation. However, unknowingly causing collateral damage to today's Catholics' freedom to join the fraternity. Before finishing, I need to thank so many people who have helped me in the preparation of this paper, too many to name them all here, but I especially wish to acknowledge the help given to me by Right Reverend Geoffrey Scott, the Abbot of Douay Abbey near Reading, with information on Sir John's early life, and Brother Aubrey Newman for his wise guidance throughout the preparation of this paper. So if there are any questions, could you please send them via the email address on the screen. A version of this paper is currently available via the QC website, which I understand has generated quite a lot of questions already, which I will answer in the published version of the paper in AQC. Finally, I thank you all for your attention.